So, good afternoon to all of you. Uh, in the last class, we have studied or we have discussed how the life originated on this earth. And in the last class, afterwards, even I couldn't complete because of some technical fault. Uh, Now, once we know how the proto life, or what we can call the primitive life, came into existence from the non-living things as a result of so many factors which prevailed in the primordial earth. Now, what we have to concentrate on is how this prototype or this primitive life evolved into this much diversity what we observe on this earth at the present day. Not only on the present day, even many of them have become extinct also, including them also. What made them to take different shapes, size, habitats, so many other things over a long period of time? We can say that in one word, it is because of the evolution. Okay, what we the entire process we call it as evolution. But how exactly this must have happened? Again, there is no conclusive absolute evidence in support of all these things. But certainly there are certain theories which logically explain us about this development of or the diversity what we have today. So here these theories proposed by many philosophers, scientists has been substantiated by evidences also nowadays. So that's why first, in order to understand this process of evolution, first let's try to understand about some of the theories which help us in understanding this process of evolution better. So these theories which with respect to this evolution are initially contributed by philosophers, later by taxonomists, recently by molecular and genetics, molecular biologists and genetics. So there's a lot of theories have been proposed to substantiate the process of evolution. So first I will show you a photograph because in science in olden days we always starts with this photograph. This is all of you know Aristotle who lived in 334 to 322 BC before Christ. Why I am showing this photograph? This man is the first person who tried to explain the principles that are lying behind this evolution. So that's why he is also considered as the first man to who tried to explain the evolution, or at least who gave some scientific inputs for the better understanding of this magnanimity of the diversity that we have and the process of evolution. So there are different theories proposed by different scientists. The first one is known as spontaneous generation. What is this spontaneous generation? This is the theory proposed for centuries, mainly based on the belief. Just by interpreting what they see, what they have heard, what they have imagined. There is no testing of what they say. It's a spontaneous generation. They never used any scientific methods to draw the inference of what they have observed. So all their conclusions were based on some untested observation. During olden days, in every city, town, or in state, there used to be some wise man who the people think, and whatever the things he say, people used to blindly agree to that. The spontaneous generation theory is one such theory. They have given different example. What do you mean by spontaneous generation? The organism evolves spontaneously. All of a sudden, they evolve. They arise. They originated all of a sudden from Dino. We don't know from where and when. One fun morning, we saw this and this has evolved, originated. That's what they're thinking. They have given some example also, especially in the Nile River in Egypt. Every year during the spring, the Nile River gets flood. The Egypt along the river, leaving behind the nutrient mud. Usually, when the flood comes on the flood plain, the nutrient-rich soil or mud gets deposited, and there the people used to grow crops for their food. But very interestingly, along with this mud, the people also used to get large number of frogs appeared, and they were not there when the riverbed was dried. Only when they get flood, they used to get large number of frogs. So the people conclude that muddy soil gave rise to the frogs. Because when the mud started depositing, the frogs also appeared, and people started thinking that the muddy soil somehow, we don't know how and when and where they appear. Because of this muddy soil, frogs arise. Origin of frogs, they say that in the muddy soil. This is the belief I am talking. Another example, many parts of Europe in the medieval period, farmers, the agriculturists used to store their grains in the barns, in the thatched roofs, like you might have seen in photographs, Shakespeare's house. Thatched roofs, hut, it is nothing but a hut. So here, at the roof edge, it was not uncommon that it start leaking. And this leakage, because during the rains, spoiled the grains. What happens if the rain water or if the dampness affect the grain? Molds grow up, and of course there are a lot of molds. And when the grains are there, they attract lot of rats also, rats and mice also. Then they found that they concluded that mice came from this moldy grains. That's what I am told. There is no scientific proof. What they observed, they used to believe. So in the city centuries ago, uh, there were no people to sweep, no garbage trucks, no electricity, no refrigeration. Sewage used to flow in the streets, urban sewage. Chamber pots and leftover food were thrown out in the street each morning. As a result of that, many cities were having the major rat problem and bubonic plague at that time. When you throw them, it attracts rats, and rats will grow exponentially because of the food that they get. What the people thought was, whatever the sewage and garbage that they have thrown, they turned into rats. Now it may appear foolish for all of us, but just think about those days. See, another example, when there is a meat, because those days refrigerators were not there, and so the meat battling the flies around the carcasses, when something dies or meat is kept, it attracts lots of flies. And then the people thought that rotting meat had given the flies, because flies lays egg and maggots will emerge from those eggs. So people thought that maggots appeared from this decaying meat. Even people, how foolish this is, you may laugh. How the bees originate? If you want some bees, the easiest way, they have proposed that kill a young bull and bury it in an upright position so that its horn should come out of the soil. After a month, swarm of bees will fly out of the corpse. So if they want bees, they can kill a young bull and bury like this. So you know that if anything, if it is not perfectly buried, naturally it is attracted by the bees and they lay eggs and swarm of bees will be there. This is what we call the spontaneous generation. But this type of idea didn't last for a long time. There are many wise people started disapproving this. It was in 1968, Francisco Redi, an Italian physician, he did an experiment with flies with wide mouth jar containing the meat. See, he selected ready used open and closed flasks, and both the flasks were having the meat. He hypothesized that rotten meat does not turn into flies. What he did was, one flask was kept open, another was sealed with a parchment paper, in another it was thoroughly boiled and covered. He could see the flies only in the open flask, not in the other, because the flies come and visit, and if they lay eggs, then only the other flies will emerge. But because of the two other flasks were sealed, no flies can enter inside the flask and lay eggs. So maggots didn't develop. He found that the flask was closed with a lid, so adult flies could not get in, and no maggots developed on the rotting meat also. But whereas in the flask without a lid, these maggots were seen in the meat because adult flies had laid the eggs and more adult flies soon appeared from that one. So this is how, so this is the photograph how Francisco Redi disapproved the theory of spontaneous generation like this. So then it disproved the idea of spontaneous generation for larger organism, but still then people used to believe that if not the large organisms, probably the microscopic organisms like algae and other bacteria, they arise spontaneously. But at least he is the first person who could disprove the theory of spontaneous generation. Of course, Reddy used the scientific method. What is the scientific method? First one is observation, then question, and build the hypothesis, and confirm the hypothesis based on the observation and observations, based on the experimental data and hypothesis. So this is ultimately develops into a theory of law. So Reddy could scientifically disprove this observation, hypothesis, experiment, then either accept or reject or modify the hypothesis, and ultimately a theory or law will develop. So then he also suggested there were flies around the meat carcasses at the butcher shop, and uh, they have laid the eggs, and from the eggs it has come, the flies have come. Rotten meat does not turn into flies, only flies can make more flies. Wide mouth jars, openness allowed the flies to lay the eggs, whereas not the control groups. So these are all presence of flies, control groups. He could disprove this theory of spontaneous generation. As I have told you, though the people agreed for the larger organism, they were thinking that probably the many of the microscopic organisms were coming from this spontaneously evolving. So for that, another scientist, Otto von Leeuwenhoek in 1974, simple because he has invented the simple microscope which all of you know. With the invention of the microscope, the entire concept about this spontaneous generation was disproved because he often made new microscope for each specimen and examined water and visualized tiny animals, algae, single cell, and he called them animalcules, microbes in the 19th century. This is Otto von Leeuwenhoek in 1962, known for his microscope, invention of microscope. This is the first Leeuwenhoek's microscope, very simple microscope. Then he suggested that they also do not come from there. It is in 1745 another scientist, Needham, showed that microorganisms flourished in the various soups that has been exposed to air. When you expose the soup for a long time, it naturally develops many of the microorganisms, and he claimed that there was a life force present in the molecules of all inorganic matter, and that could cause the spontaneous generation to occur. John Needham, he suggested that there is a force, life force, in the molecules of all inorganic matter, because soup was also inorganic matter, including air and oxygen, and that must have caused the spontaneous generation too. He gave he done some experiment also to stop this spontaneous generation. Even people didn't realize bacteria were already present in the soup, uh, because Needham did not boil the soup enough to kill the microbes. He just boiled it and left it. And chicken broth, he took it, and naturally it will have some microbial growths. And a day later, broth appeared clear of life after boiling, and uh, broth was having microbes, and these microbes were not properly uh, killed. So that started evolving again. So then origin arising there. Then this Needham told that, yeah, in some microbes, some life forces are there in the inorganic material, and they gave rise to this microscopes. It was Pelangeni in 1965. What he did was he boiled the soup for almost an hour and sealed the container by melting the glass. Then the soup remained clear. Later he broke the seal and the soup became cloudy with microbes. When he broke the seal, within 1 or 2 days, the soup became cloudy with microbes. But when it was perfectly boiled and sealed, the soup was clear. That means uh, broth headed, growth was there. The flask sealed, no growth. And when you open the flask, the growth was. This is Pelagian. Uh, but people were against this one. Many people started criticizing this Pelagianist experiment, saying that when he sealed the oil and boiled it continuously, he must have destroyed all the life force within the because of heating, boiling, all the life force have been uh, killed, and so because of that, the life didn't appear. Therefore, spontaneous generation still remain a theory at that time, even after the Spelungenist experiment. The theory was finally changed uh, when Louis Pasteur in 1860, a debate had become so heated that Paris Academy of Science offered a prize for any experiment that would help to resolve this conflict. Eranjani told that no, 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 it is because of the microbes already existing, the new life came. But uh, the other schools suggested that by boiling and sealing, you didn't allow the air to enter, and whatever the life forces are there, that has been killed because of excessive boiling. So this prize was claimed in 1864 by Louis Pasteur as he published the results of his experiment, which disproved the spontaneous generation even in microscopic organisms. Louis Pasteur, he suggested that microbes come from cells of the organism, which may be along with the dust particle in the air, not the air itself. Air will be clean, but whatever the dust particles they may contain or contaminated by these microbes. So Pasteur conducted an experiment using S-shaped or swan's neck-shaped flasks. He put the broth. Broth is nothing but the mixture of it's a soup, meat and other ingredients. Each flask was boiled and placed in various locations. S-shaped flask filled with the broth, and special shape was intended to trap any dust particles containing the bacteria. Now, air can pass, but in this S-shaped flask, the bacteria gets trapped. In the Pasteur experiment, what he did, he boiled the flask with broth. All the microbes in the broth was killed, and then flask left at various locations. But they did not turn cloudy. Microbes were not found. The dust get collected at the neck of the flask. So dust cannot enter inside, but air can enter inside. So then what he did, he broke the this stem having this S-shaped neck. Then within couple of days, microbial growth was seen. Even Francisco Redi in 1968 also did that, but he couldn't convince them. John Needham experiment was a failure, which all of you know. Elangeni also tried to disprove this spontaneous generation, but it was Louis Pasteur could scientifically disapprove the theory of spontaneous generation. That is, then another theory came, that is theory of biogenesis. These are the steps in the history of evolution. During 18th century, naturalists were discovering the evidences, but uh, not recognized. Mostly, still then, the people were believing about the Bible and many of our religious texts have also their own say in uh, discussing this evolution. Uh, but in the beginning of the 18th century, there was a change in the intellectual atmosphere all over the world. Scientists first and later the public started gradually accepting the different ideas. It may be principles of uniformitarianism or Earth's great age or different things. In spite of that, there was a failure to develop a theoretical framework to explain the process of evolution. During this period, the Louis Pasteur himself has proposed one more theory, that is the theory of biogenesis. What he suggested was life originates from pre existing life. If already life is there, from the already existing life, new life will emerge or arise. This is what the theory of biogenesis is. From the pre existing life, new life will come. But he failed to explain how the new life comes from the existing life. But he was sure that all this diversity in the flora and fauna and microbes, all this came from already existing life, but failed to explain the process. It was in 1809, Jean Baptiste de Lamarck, he has put forth another theory to explain this particular evolution, how the new life with the new modifications, a new life with new modification arise from the already existing life. It's an hypothesis, very simple. That is how spontaneously a very simple organisms evolve to greater complexity, from very simple to higher level of complexity. That's what he proposed. All the present day organisms with their highest level of complexity, they have emerged spontaneously from the most simplest organism. In other way, the most simplest organism spontaneously modified or evolved to a greater complex organism. In order to support this, for his hypothesis, there were three principles. Though many of the principles were discarded now, But really, we should appreciate the logic that Lamarck has, and based on simple logic, he could propose three principles. What is this? The first principle says that all organisms constantly strive to improve themselves, irrespective of the type of the organism. Either it may be most primitive organism, or maybe highly evolved organism like human being. All of them they continuously strive to improve themselves, because all living beings are found in the nature. Naturally, the organisms wants to live in harmony with the nature. If the organisms are in harmony with the nature, they can lead a more successful life. In order to remain harmony with the nature, the organisms constantly strive to improve upon themselves, either to the existing environment or to the changing environment. Because all of you agree to the fact that nature is always dynamic. It's changing, it's fluid. When the nature is a dynamic entity, naturally organisms which are living in this nature should also be more fluidic or more dynamic, so that they can also improve upon themselves even with the slightest change in the environment. As a result of this, the Lamarck says that organisms continuously and constantly striving themselves to improve upon themselves, so that they become more and more better year by year or generation by generation. This is the first principle. I'm not talking about the validity of the principle right now. Later, about the validity, we can discuss later. The second principle says that most used body structures develop and unused waste away, which is popularly known as use and disuse theory. What does it mean? Any organ or any part of the body, if it is used continuously, that will develop into a very strong structure, more useful structure, more handy structure. Whereas the organ which is not used will disintegrate, will disappear. This is another principle. Hope you have understood what I mean. Any part of the body, any organ of the body which has been used continuously will develop into a strong, become more stronger structure, more stronger. The one which is not used will disappear. For the time being, just you hear. I'm not giving any examples or anything right. What is the third principle? A structure is modified by use and disuse. What the second principle says? A structure is modified by use and disuse. Any structure, if it is used, it will modify it into stronger one. If it is not used, they will disappear. But the third statement doesn't stop here. These modifications are inherited to their offspring. If the parent develops such structure, offsprings by birth he will get them. Whatever the characters a person in develops in his life, in his course of life, those characters are inherited to their offspring. So their offsprings or children, by birth, they will get those characters. That means inheritance of acquired character. So these are the three principles of Lama. First one is organisms constantly strive to improve themselves for various reasons. Second one is use and disuse theory. The third one is inheritance of this acquired character by the offspring. It appears very logical. Now let's try to understand the background. How Lamar could propose his three principles. Of course, with great respect, because he is the first scientist to propose a system of evolution. Though we may not agree absolutely to what Lamarck has proposed during those days, but certainly the efforts that have been made by the Lamarck to propose a system of evolution should be highly appreciated and even today. Now I was talking about what made the Lamarck to come to such a conclusion. During that period, lot of excavation work was going on in the earth. When he observed the fossils that got unearthed, he observed that in the lower layer of the earth crust or in the lower strata of the earth crust, there were simplest organisms. In the more recent layers, that is the layers at the top, they were having more complex fossils. The lower strata, they were having more simplest organisms, whereas the fossils becomes more complex in more recent rock strata. By observing observing and comparing the fossils of the lower strata and the upper strata, he believed that there is an internal drive based on the need. Drive is always based on the need, like hunger drive you have now. There is an internal drive in all living beings towards complexity. There is an internal inbuilt need based drive to become more and more complex. He also believed that each species came from less complex one. That means the ancestors of the complex species were also simpler species. Complexity is a later addition, but basically all these complex forms of life came from the more simplest ancestors. He also believed that evolution is based on this internal drive to become more and more complex. Based on his belief, first I should remember, not by scientific validation, based on this belief, he said that characteristics are acquired because of the gene of the organism to become more and more complex. Because of this internal gene to develop into more and more complexity, the organisms started acquiring additional characteristics, or whatever the characteristics prevailed, they used to get it modified. So this helped him to propose this theory of use and disuse and theory of acquired characters. For this, he has also given the example of necks of giraffe. In olden days, giraffes were very simpler, like our cattle, having a short neck, used to browse on the grass, used to browse on the grass. But during that period, something must have happened. As a result, giraffes could no longer depend only on the grass. Maybe famine, drought, or anything might have happened. Then there was no grass, or even if that it was very less. So giraffes started eating the leaves of the tree. So in order to browse the grass, they have to bend their head downwards. But in order to eat the leaves, they have to look up. They stretched the neck in order to eat the leaves. This stretching of the neck continued from generation to generation. How many generations we don't know. But after nth generation, giraffes were having long neck because they continuously stretched their neck, raised their shoulder. So that's why their forelimbs are taller. They raised their shoulders and stretched their neck in order to reach the leaves at the higher reaches continuously. In each generation, because of the stretching and raising, must have resulted in the increase of few millimeter. After nth generation, that is that at today, if you see giraffes are having long necks. This is what he said as a cumulative effect of acquired character over this nth generation. Present day giraffes are having long necks. Simultaneously, he also suggested that an unconscious, not conscious, unconsciously, all lower creatures are trying to become more complex, more human like creatures. Because people were knowing that human is at the height of the evolution. That's a continual. effort by the lower creatures unconsciously to become more complex. So, by this, what has happened is, forget about the evolution. It ignited a zeal among other scientists to understand the natural world more scientifically, more logically. And during this time, new traits arise in organisms because of their needs, and somehow they get passed from generation to their descendants. And this theory was alarmingly welcomed by all the people during that time because this appeared to be more logical with some examples, though they may not be scientifically validated examples, but he could give a convincing examples. Logically, he can prove. Then, now, what is the present status of Lamarck's theory? Even today, Lamarck's theory is not totally refuted. Remember, all of us have, all evolutionary biologists have highest respect for Lamarck for logically explaining that. But now, in the present scenario, Lamarck's theory is mostly obsolete because now we have reached to the molecular level, to the genes, which are the units of heredity, and using that, we are explaining this theory, the evolution. Because we know now that we cannot alter the structure by any effort by an organism during its lifetime. And the characters cannot be passed from one generation to another generation. So this is what the photograph of Lamarck's giraffe. So original short-necked giraffe stretching the neck to reach the leaves, and long-necked giraffes. Now giraffes cannot browse; they have to depend on the leaves only. So what he suggested, ancestral short-necked giraffes stretched their necks to reach the leaves of high on the trees, and their offsprings born with long neck. Even he used another example, the crabs, and uh, about them probably I will discuss in the next class because the time is not permitting, and I hope uh, you're all hungry and it's 1:30. So, any doubt? ಏನು ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತಾ? ಹಲೋ, ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತಾ, ಕಾಣಿಸ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತಾ? ಸಂಜೀವ್ ಸಾಂಗ್ರೆ, ಸಂಜಯ್ ಹೇಳು,
Yes, sir.
ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತಾ, ಕಾಣ್ತಾ
ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಿತ್ತು.
ಹಾ?
ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಿತ್ತು ಸರ್.
ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಕಾಣ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತಾ?
ಹೌದು ಸರ್.
So, okay, then uh, for the day we will